Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're at in the world. Welcome to the third and final day of the 2020 International eConference on Religion and the Holocaust. I'm Dr. Darren Slade. I'm president of the Global Center for Religious Research. And I want to say thank you so much for being in attendance today. I'm very excited about who we have presenting today, and I have the distinct privilege of being able to introduce to you Professor George Dunn. And allow me to share my screen so I can give him a proper introduction. Professor George Dunn is going to be discussing René Girard on the Holocaust and its aftermath. Now, Professor Dunn is an accomplished research fellow at the Institute for Globalizing Culture in Dunn University, a recognized scholar on René Girard and Chinese religious thought, head of global philosophy of religion at the Global Center for Religious Research. He studied philosophy at both Purdue University and Christian Theological Seminary. He's held teaching positions at the University of Indianapolis, Purdue University, and Zhejiang University. And he's also the author and editor of 8 books in English. And I say English because he also has books that are also in Chinese. Now, I want to highlight 2 of Professor Dunn's books, some of his more popular and recent books. This one is The Philosophy of Christopher Nolan. And if you know Christopher Nolan, you know that his work is just spectacular. Christopher Nolan is the creator of works such as the Dark Knight trilogy, Memento, and other Inception. These movies have had such a huge impact on our culture. And so what Professor Dunn has done is he's collected several essays from philosophers and professional film critics who explore the different themes and motifs in Christopher Nolan's movies. If you ever have a chance to read this book, it is absolutely excellent, and it's going to be even more timely since Christopher Nolan's newest movie is coming out, Tenet. The second one that I want to highlight is The Hunger Games and Philosophy. And if you know about the Hunger Games movies, you know that these things are such a poignant message, a great social commentary on our world today. So this book, which also has a collection of essays from professional philosophers, explores questions like, do ordinary moral rules apply in the arena? Can the world of the Hunger Games shine a light into the dark corners of our world today? And why do we often enjoy watching other people suffer? So if you have a chance to ever take a look at these books, I highly recommend them. And with that said, I want to turn it over to Professor Dunn. Take it away, sir.
Thank you very much, Darren. Well, let me start by saying a couple things. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored that Darren, invited me to come and talk to you today about René Girard and the Holocaust. Also, with respect to the 2 books that Darren mentioned, I do want to mention that I have co-editors on each of those books. So The Philosophy of Christopher Nolan was co-edited with Jason Eberl, who is also going to be the speaker at this conference, speaking this evening, I believe. And then The Hunger Games and Philosophy, that was co-authored with Nicholas Michaud. So René Girard. René Girard was born in 1923. He died just a few years ago in 2015. He was a French historian, literary critic, religious thinker, a man who wore many, many hats. He taught for several decades at Stanford University. In 2005, he became one of 40 immortals when he was inducted as a member of the French Academy. His thought is very hard to classify, but I think maybe the best way of describing it is as a contribution to the tradition of philosophical anthropology. That is, the philosophical attempt to understand the meaning of being human. He is a Catholic Christian, and his religious faith, as you'll soon find out, figures very importantly in his scholarly work. And his influence has been fairly extensive. He's influenced literary criticism, critical theory, anthropology, theology, psychology, mythology, sociology, economics, philosophy, just all across the disciplines. Now, the theory for which he is best known, his philosophical anthropology, is generally known as mimetic theory. So what I want to do first is take some time to explain what mimetic theory is, and then talk about its application to our understanding of the Holocaust. Now, Girard's mimetic theory is typically presented as developing through three key insights. The first concerns what Girard calls mimetic desire and rivalry. The word mimetic comes from the Greek word mimesis, which has to do with imitation. So in a nutshell, what Girard is claiming about desire is that our desires don't just well up spontaneously. We imitate the desires of others. And he thinks that routinely gives rise to envy, resentment, rivalry, and all kinds of conflicts. His second insight concerns what he calls the scapegoat mechanism. And this is an account of the origin of religion and culture, and is based on his insight into how human groups use scapegoating to resolve the crises that arise from mimetic rivalry. And scapegoating is a way of restoring social cohesion when communities become fractured by conflicts. And then the third of his insights has to do with the uniqueness of biblical religion. So he's a very, very interesting account of how biblical narratives have undermined the scapegoat mechanism by revealing the innocence of the scapegoat, and that he thinks the Bible had a transformative effect on Western civilization. Now, this third part of his theory is by far the most controversial aspect, but it's also, in some ways, the most crucial aspect of his theory for understanding his view of the Holocaust. So I want to start by explaining each of these elements of his mimetic theory, and then discuss what kind of light they can shed on the Holocaust. So we'll start with mimetic desire and rivalry. So contrary to romantic conceptions of desire, where desire springs spontaneously from the deep and mysterious recesses of our subjectivity, and contrary to classical theories that ascribe a kind of innate desirability to certain objects. Some objects are just good, and human beings have the capacity to discern their goodness, and that's what draws us to them. In contrast to those views, Girard describes desire as an essentially triangular or mimetic phenomenon, in which the subject's desire for an object is typically aroused by the presence of a mediator, someone whose own desire, or even apparent desire, for that object creates and confirms the object's desirability in the eyes of the subject. Right? So, why do I desire Mary Lou? Well, because my best friend Bob desires Mary Lou, right? And Bob's desire for Mary Lou alerts me to the fact that she's desirable, right? And so I imitate his desire. Now, the problem that arises from this should be pretty evident from the example I gave. Because when two or more desires converge on a single object, that only one person can possess. And it might be the romantic affections of somebody, or it might be a job, or it might be something as abstract as a certain measure of prestige in my field, or it might be a concrete object that I'm competing with someone over. But when our desires converge on a single object, we have a recipe for the most acrimonious rivalries and bitter resentments. And when those rivalries are sufficiently exacerbated, they can erupt into violence. So Girard thinks that this proneness to rivalry is just built into the structure of human desire, because we naturally desire the things that other people desire, and that makes us rivals. And so a kind of classical double bind situation arises, where the model of one's desire, as the person whose desire I'm imitating, becomes the primary obstacle to the fulfillment of my desire, because he wants it too, and he's standing in the way of my getting it. And that only enhances the prestige of the object and intensifies the desire to possess it. Okay? But then when the model sees how intensely I desire that object, then the model clings to it even more fiercely, or redoubles his efforts to acquire it if he doesn't possess it already. So this creates a kind of very, very, very dangerous positive feedback loop in which the rival who thwarts my desire serves at the same time to inflame it. And that just throws more kindling on desire and on the rivalry. Now, part of the problem here is that mimetic desire works as kind of a spell that causes each of the rivals to mistake his or her desire for something wholly spontaneous and original. So I don't understand that I'm desiring this object because someone else is desiring it, or because someone else has somehow signaled its desirability. I think of my desire as arising completely spontaneously. And because of that, when we get into rivalries, it's very, very hard for the rivals to avoid seeing the actions of the rival as anything but just a wholly perverse and gratuitous attempt to frustrate him. And that's why mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry is so dangerous. And what often happens, according to Girard, is once the rivalry gets going, the desired object just kind of retreats into the background. We forget about Mary Lou, right? We're not right now. We're entirely focused on each other and our resentment and hatred of each other. Right? And so the contest between us becomes what Girard calls metaphysical, because it's no longer about a concrete object, right? The rivalry is just fueling itself, and the object has just completely dropped out of the picture. Now, that's the problem with human desire. And Girard thinks that these conflicts that arise because of our rivalries are also contagious. So Girard thinks that as conflict and as violence escalates, it has a tendency just to widen as this mimetic process pulls more and more people into its vortex. Okay? So it's very, very quickly we can end up with the sort of situation that Thomas Hobbes describes in the Leviathan, when he speaks of the condition of human beings in the state of nature as the war of all against all. Girard has a very, very similar picture of what happens when we don't have these various kinds of brakes on our desire. And there are various kinds of brakes. There are social norms that might prevent our desire. from getting out of hand or prevent rivalry from escalating to the point of violence. We have institutional breaks on it, right? So we have police, we have a judicial system that can intervene and help us manage our rivalries. But Girard invites us to imagine a situation at the dawn of human history where we possess neither the instincts nor like a system of jurisprudence, nor strong social norms that can staunch the tide of mimetic rivalry or mimetic violence. And Girard thinks that this is the situation that our earliest ancestors found themselves in. Our earliest human ancestors, maybe even some of our early hominid ancestors. So, in such a situation, he thinks that this heat of mimetic rivalry and violence just leads to something like a societal meltdown. And out of that comes this what he describes as a violent undifferentiation. Everybody is the same as everybody else, right? Because everybody desires what everybody else has. And everybody is full of the same kind of acrimony towards everybody else. And this becomes the war of all against all. And so then the question, and this leads to the second part of Girard's mimetic theory, having to do with scapegoating. The question is, what, if anything, can possibly staunch this tide of violent undifferentiation? And Girard's insight is that this process of mimetic dissolution, breakdown of society, can be halted through an act of scapegoating. The scapegoating could be spontaneous, or, as we'll see in the case of the Nazis, it could be engineered. But with scapegoating, we have a community that was formerly fractured. Everybody is fighting against everybody else. We have that community united.
Sorry about that, everyone. I have Professor Dunn refreshing his page right now, so you get to listen to me kind of ad-lib for him for just a second while he comes back in. But he will be joining us real quick. And yes, this presentation will be recorded. This part will be edited out. So, and are you guys able to hear me right now? All right. Thank you, Bernice. Thank you, Kenton, for everybody for saying that you can hear me. So Professor Dunn just messaged me saying that his computer had crashed. He was having with his computer all morning, a little bit flustered. So, but he's actually coming back in right now.
Darren, I'm back. Can you see me? Hear me?
Professor Dunn, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Great. My apologies. My computer doesn't want me to give this presentation, but I'm gonna do my best to give it anyway. So I guess Darren was covering for me while I was gone, but I'm back. So let me pick up where I left off. I was talking about the scapegoating mechanism, right? And Girard refers to the scapegoating mechanism, calls it a mechanism, to indicate how it operates with the same kind of automatic and unconscious efficacy as any kind of machine. It's not something that requires conscious guidance from rational agents. This scapegoating mechanism, according to Girard, exploits the mimetic propensity of human beings, but in this case, instead of imitating each other's acquisitive gestures, we imitate each other's accusative gestures, right? And so the gravitational pull of mimesis ensures that pretty soon everybody's fingers will be pointing in the same direction. Someone makes a forceful accusation. There's somebody who is different in some way. You know, maybe like Oedipus, maybe he's lame. You know, maybe he's different because he has bright red hair. It doesn't matter. Just somebody is different enough to attract everybody's attention, and pretty soon, because of mimesis, because of imitation, everybody's fingers are pointing in the same direction at a single culprit whom we can all agree to blame. And Girard thinks that this is how communities historically have been able to discharge all of that pent-up hostility and frustration that arises because of the nature of human desire and human rivalry. Now, I'll explain in a moment why Girard thinks that the scapegoating mechanism does not work nowadays in the same way as it did in antiquity. But he does say, and this is a quote from Girard, that these mechanisms do continue in our world, usually as only a trace. So we all are familiar with the phenomenon of scapegoating. We see it in families, we see it at work, we see it in the political arena. It usually does not have the kind of capacity to unite an entire culture in the way that it did in the past. But Girard says occasionally these mechanisms can reappear in forms more virulent than ever and on an enormous scale. And an example is Hitler's systematic destruction of European Jews. Now, Girard thinks that early human communities were either decimated by the ravages of mimetic violence, or they were delivered through episodes of scapegoating. And he thinks primitive religion arose out of this practice of scapegoating. He thinks that over time, that the scapegoat becomes kind of a god. The lynching of the victim becomes memorialized in sacrificial rituals and other practices. And prohibitions are put in place, taboos, to prevent the return of mimetic violence. So for Girard, primitive religion, as well as every contemporary religion, precisely to the extent that it retains elements of sacrificial practice, is a kind of dim and distorted memory of the origins of human culture and scapegoating violence. Now, Girard thinks, and this is where he starts making some very controversial claims. Because the mimetic spell disables our power to recognize it, he thinks that nothing less than divine intervention can really restore our sanity. And that's not just hyperbole for Girard. As I mentioned before, Girard is a Christian, and he believes that he has discovered what he refers to as a revelation of the scapegoat mechanism in a number of biblical narratives. In other words, there are biblical stories that depict scapegoating. Girard thinks that a prime instance of this is the Passion narrative in the Gospels, but he thinks there are others. So in the book of Genesis, the Joseph cycle, or the book of Job, he thinks is all about scapegoating. But what is unique, according to Girard, about the biblical text is that it presents scapegoating from the perspective of the victim, whereas every other mythological text, he thinks, I'm not sure he's exactly right about this, but he does make the claim that every other mythological text presents the scapegoat as guilty and the scapegoating community as innocent. The biblical text reverses that the scapegoat is innocent, and it's the community that is guilty. So Girard writes, instead of blaming victimization on the victims, the gospel, blame it on the victimizers. As I said, not just the Gospels, but also text in the Hebrew Bible. What myths systematically hide, the Bible reveals. The difference is not merely moral.